Good morning, I'm Matthew Torres. Welcome back to Morning Line. With me right now is Vanderbilt University political science professor Thomas Schwartz. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's get back to the lines because I know we have some callers who've been waiting. I know we have Grady. Grady, good morning. What's your question?
Matthew, professor. You know, Alabama had passed the law where they couldn't have any immigrants, but then they let the crops rot in the field because they had nobody to harvest it. You know, I mean, we've got to take a little bit of everybody. You know, when they fought the Irish, you know, then the Irish come in here. They've done pretty good as immigrants. You know, and the president apparently couldn't find a wife he could keep unless he immigrated one. And, you know, then he brought her family in. So, you know, I mean, he's speaking out of twofold of his mouth. But they've got kids from Brazil that speak Portuguese that they're trying to interpret for them with somebody other than speaks Portuguese. So, you know, if we're going to take these kids as prisoners, we'll at least have somebody that talks their language. I'll hang up listening to y'all's comments this morning.
Thank you, Grady.
Well, Grady's point, I mean, the idea of crops rotting in the fields because you can't find immigrant labor is, of course, one of the things that is, when I was talking about sort of two-sided or two-faced immigration policy, we really do. On the one hand, we really want benefits of cheap, unskilled labor at times. We also, you know, and as mentioned or reference to the fact that the president's married to an immigrant, we are a society of immigrants. There are very few people who can trace their ancestry back more than 3 or 4 generations here relative to the population as a whole. My grandparents were immigrants. I mean, most people feel this, at least in part. Now, that doesn't mean that we want completely open borders, but I think it does mean that we have this very complicated relationship to immigration, which will not really change and really would require some sort of bipartisan consensus that I think maybe a different president could get. This president probably won't get a full consensus, I don't think. We may get a few minor solutions, but it may take a while before we get some sort of real resolution of this.
And that's why it's so interesting to me. States like Arizona or Texas, just very high political climates, landscapes, where the immigrant workers are such a big help. Me being from Texas, you see that anywhere. So it's always interesting to me what the outcome or even the ramifications of something like this can happen to not just main businesses, but local businesses too.
As well.
Okay, let's go back to the lines. I believe we have, hey David, is that you? What's your question?
Isn't part of the problem that in America you only want to broadcast to the rest of the world and to the nation itself positive images? You don't want to broadcast the negative. You don't want to use the original canons of journalistic ethics, and you portray a rosy picture that unemployment is low. And that only applies to those who recently lost their job and are applying for unemployment. Those who have been chronically unemployed or have run out of time that they could be on the benefits aren't counted. And when the economic depression ends, the government says it ends. In all reality, it didn't end. And if everyone wants to have this uncontrolled immigration, then why not have the billionaires open concentration camps and kill every poor man, woman, and child born in poverty in this nation and put them in it, including me?
All right, thank you for that, David.
David had a point that, in effect, we still have an issue of worker participation and worker percentage of workers in the workforce that has not yet gone back to historic levels, particularly of men, lower skilled men who are outside of the workforce and who are not counted by the unemployment figures. So there are still issues of unemployment in the country despite the very, very low unemployment rate, because it only measures people who are looking for jobs. And what's happened is a large number of people have exited the workforce and are not counted, and that is an issue still, and I think it's one of the reasons why immigration is still a heated issue, because I think if there are still large, and then certainly pockets of the country where this is a chronic problem and contributes in part to the opioid crisis and other issues.
What do you think of him saying as far as the presentation of the rosy news, the feel-good news.
I don't think that's necessarily the case, because I think I do think, when you think about it, yeah, there are governments that do crack down on bad news. North Korea being one. There's no government. Everything is rosy there. You would never see any of the hunger or starvation that existed there. Turkey, Russia, some of these governments now that have enacted censorship. I think our media still is, for the most part, one of the freest medias in the world, and does frequently do negative news. I think what's happened in our media is that it's split into factions now too. So if you wanted a negative view of the Obama administration, you turned on Fox News. If you wanted a positive view, you turned on MSNBC, and now that's reversed. And what you've got going on now is that you've got a multitude of views coming out of the conditions in the country, and it's hard in some ways sometimes to get at any sort of larger objective view.
And truthfully, from our perspective, I guess people clump local media as well with what mainstream media, the cable news, the networks are doing. So we do feel the effects of that, where we do focus on the local impact, the local news, and people may perceive that sometimes as negative, but it's really issues that are affecting people, which at most times can be negative. And so let's go back to the lines now. Tom, good morning to you. Welcome to Morning Line. What's your question?
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. What's your question?
Listen to all this immigration stuff that's going on. And, the Mexicans are, I don't think there's nothing wrong with it. At least they're here working and taking care. I mean, there's what feeding us.
All right. Thank you for that, Tom.
That's
going back to...
Yeah. I mean, in effect, we benefit from immigration as a society. Sometimes that does not always look well, in the sense that some immigrant workers mistreated and don't have quite the conditions that they should. But I think people are aware that a society like ours would be very seriously impacted if we cut off all immigration. We are part of our economic growth, our vitality comes from people wanting to come here and make their way.
Well, there's also the argument that Americans should have the American jobs.
Right.
But at the same time, I guess that's the argument that the U.S. is, quote unquote, the land of the free for anyone.
It also gets to this idea that American citizens often are unwilling to do certain types of labor. Right. And that's an uncomfortable one.
A good point is how many, I guess, with these positions would you see?
Yes,
particular labor jobs.
And particular types of jobs are seen as demeaning or being paid too little, but people from other countries where the conditions are very different are willing to do these jobs, and that's been one of the constant arguments, for example, of farmers in states like California and Texas who do bring in or Alabama, who bring in immigrant labor.
And it's not even just the hard labor itself, but other immigrants coming into the country who then support their families back home.
That's right. I mean, they could still do much better here, even at low wages. They still do much better here than they can in these countries. I mean, in that sense, one of the things is to go back to something that I had mentioned earlier, one of the things that's the problem is the poverty in Central America and other places that drives people away from those places, that makes them want to search for better opportunity.
Almost seek refuge in this country. All right. Hey, Tony, good morning. What's your question?
Some of this is on immigration, some not. But I want to really say is, this is akin to the Japanese internment camps in World War II. I know these state senators and representative congressmen are sitting down on their hands and not doing nothing. You let this go on in your own state, and you don't have the power enough to tell Mr. Trump, we're not going to have it here. You could take that somewhere else. The same thing is going to happen with North Korea. Is going to send this nuclear material to Tennessee, Oak Ridge, and not one of these senators is saying nothing. Rob Coker, Lamar Alexander, none of them are saying nothing. So you let this man just rush over you and run over your state. You don't think nothing about your own state citizens to do this. Now, I think he did this to get back at Mr. Bush in Texas. But Trump should have been shut down before all this got started, because they should have been having a meeting and know about this in advance.
All right, Tony, thank you for calling.
It's an interesting thing, the degree to which Republican legislators who were very relatively uneasy with Trump now fear him in some sense, at least the ones that are continuing to run. Not Bob Corker, he can say some things, but
and he has.
But others like, and they look at the example of Mark Sanford in South Carolina, and they see here was a critic of Trump who gets defeated in his primary. The Republican Party now has become President Trump's party, and so for that reason, his legislators and the rest are going to be reluctant to defy him on these issues, and I think that's going to continue to be a mark. In a way, what could happen would be a realignment, maybe a third party or something that tries to go between, or simply a realignment of the Republicans and Democrats.
And he also mentioned the comparison with the Japanese.
He mentioned that, and that is, in our history, that's the thing that we look at and see. We did, that's one of those episodes in our history that we're embarrassed by, and so seeing people in large camps and separating their children, all that has terrible resonance for many Americans who know their history. It's
one of those things that we'll just have to wait years from now to look back into the history books. What will be said? All right, for those callers still on the line, please stick around. We'll make sure to get to you as soon as possible. We'll have much more of Morning Line after the break.
Healthier